I think if you give technology folks more details about what the business does, then they could be clear in the IT strategies they define, how they govern technology, and they can anticipate the needs of the business so that you're not stuck in this conflict between the business wants it now and IT's like, but that's not the right way to do it, which is always inevitable. But essential teams needed to define standards because different organizations that create this, it all has to look and feel the same so that you could read a process inventory for any group without kind of having a decoder ring. So things like verb noun. So every process should be named with the action because that's what a process is. We could talk about alignment, but I think that's one of the reasons why transformations fail is because of the chaos in alignment. And I think that there's a couple parts of that. There's vertical alignment. So from strategic leaders down to individual contributors, making sure that everyone is doing, acting in accordance with what the strategic objectives are. And then there's horizontal. So having kind of peer teams that know how to work with each other better. So that's business working with technology, etc.
If successful, they grow really fast. But most don't realize or accept the fact that what they're scaling is chaos. Unclear workflows, half-used tools, decisions made on guesswork. And now in 2025, we all layering AI on top of that chaos. So what happens when you automate processes you don't really fully understand? Hey, what's going on, everyone? I'm Mike Sirius, and this is Mastering Tech Growth. Every week, we chat with industry leaders to bring you no-fluff tips on how to grow. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe and send me your biggest growth questions at masteringtechgrowth.com. I'd love to know what you're working on and what keeps you up at night. Joining me today is Michael Schank. He's the founder of Process Inventory Advisors and the author of Digital Transformation Success Book. I highly recommend the book. If you're interested in the topic we're discussing here today, it goes into much more depth. For over 2 decades, Michael helped companies clean up the way they work so they can grow without the chaos. Today, he's going to walk us through his process inventory framework and break down simple steps most startups skip, as a result, creating messes they don't really realize they are creating, and explain how small bits of waste within the processes can actually have huge impact on growth. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
It's going to be an awesome one, and it's such a timely one, Michael, for me personally. So I'm launching a course or just helping businesses with Agentic AI, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the steps which I feel businesses don't really think well is that you need to really understand your processes first before you actually go into automation, right? Yep. So they instantly jump in it and they don't even think about automation. Right now, everyone's just like, let's just put AI, Agentic AI. I heard great things. It's just going to solve all my problems. So it's a very, very, very timely episode, right? So I want to start with this quote from McKinsey. 70% of digital transformations fail, often due to lack of clarity in internal processes. So to kick us off, Michael, very simple question. How do you even start with that? Like, wow. I'm a business owner, right? Like, how do I make sure I map this well?
So so I love that quote. I haven't heard that before. I've used the 70% before, but I didn't hear the second part. That's brilliant. So really what process inventory is identifying and documenting every single process your organization does. And how do you do that? You start with the top of your organizational hierarchy because you want to be complete and comprehensive in this inventory to capture everything, not just core processes, because any process can have impact on performance. But you start at the top of the organizational hierarchy and you ask a simple question. What is it that you do? And the leaders will say, I have a team that does this, that, and the other thing. Well, then you go down to their teams, you ask them what they do, and you keep walking that organizational hierarchy down until you get to individual processes. And then you go back up and you ask people to attest to it via a formal email or some other electronic form so that everyone says, yes, this is an accurate and complete representation of what we do. And that creates a taxonomy that represents everything that your business does. There's another aspect of it, which is data too. So there is a lot of data in our organizations in various unconnected data stores, like what systems do we use? What risks do we have? What vendors do we leverage, et cetera? So if you could take that data now and associate it with individual processes, you start to build a comprehensive repository of all operational intelligence from which you could drive transformation, automation, organizational performance, a whole host of things.
Okay, so you mentioned core processes, but we should map not only them but others. So, is there a way to think about processes or label them in some unique way, like core, main, and then sub
Sure.
items or something like that?
Sure, but I start with the inventory of complete first, and then you could
Okay.
put a tag of core processes, and you could define what that means. But they're typically customer facing, revenue generating, things like that. And I do think they should get a good amount of attention. But it's sometimes the bureaucratic processes that slow things down, and you can't miss those.
So that's where I was actually going. So you mentioned you start at the top and you sort of go through the core processes, and then you go within the teams. You ask them as well. Who does that? Is that like a dedicated, head of process type of role or situation, or is that more like a, I don't know, COO or like operations person? Like, who would actually run this?
Well, it depends on the size of the organization. For larger organizations, they may have a dedicated, call it process capability or process center of excellence, where there's a number of people that are responsible for constructing this and then maintaining it. Because a big question I always get is, but my organization changes all the time, and that's
Yeah.
fair. That's true. So you need a team that has some governance processes that every so often goes back out to the business and says, what has changed? Let's update this, get all the attestations again. But for smaller organizations, it could be a person or two that is, this is just their part-time job, but they take on this responsibility.
Almost like an initiative or something.
It's like an initiative or something. Exactly right. The other key way to so it's a process capability. The other key way to maintain it is to integrate it in every way that you run your business. So from how if you have all your processes laid out, it can help you define strategy by understanding what are strong areas of your business, what are weak areas of your business. Externally, where are there opportunities and threats in the landscape, so that strategic leaders are identifying where they put their finite change dollars to in an objective way.
Okay.
It can enable a transformation and the change process in general by being very clear on what processes need to change. And with all the data alignment I mentioned, once you identify the process, you know what technology is involved, what people are involved, what vendors. So now you can be very precise in what has to change. And that maintains alignment from the leaders that are saying this is what we need to do to those on the ground that are actually implementing the change. Operational excellence. So using this as a platform for identifying where there's waste and inefficiencies, not just at a process level, but at a 30,000 foot view level, where you have redundant technologies or redundant teams, where you have opportunities for streamlining or standardization or consolidation in something like a shared service or or even a outsourced partner. Enterprise architects. So I think if you give technology folks more details about what the business does, then they could be clear in the IT strategies they define, how they govern technology, and they can anticipate the needs of the business, so that you're not stuck in this conflict between the business wants it now and IT's like, but that's not the right way to do it, which is always inevitable. And then last is risk and compliance management. So if you understand all your processes, you could identify what could go wrong, and what the regulators are saying you need to comply with from a legal perspective.
That's a lot. That's a big map,
Yeah.
Michael, right? Like, I'm just thinking about the size of organizations, and I work for enterprises. And when I think about all things we do, that's a lot of information. So, how do you manage all of that? Are we talking about dedicated softwares to map out the processes, or is it just purely some type of like workflow type of tool where you just, have a buckets of processes and some arrows goes from this to that, or is it more sophisticated than this?
There's technology is definitely part of it, depending on how big and ambitious you go with this. There are process mapping tools out there like Eris, GB Tech, Signavio. There's a lot out there, and the good news is it's a fairly mature market with really
Okay.
great capabilities. But that's one thing, is just documenting your environment. And then you could add workflow on top of that as well, because once you know your processes, now you could start to draw connections. What is the end-to-end process, and where does one process hand off to the next, from the view of a value stream, or a customer, from a customer journey perspective.
Okay.
But you could do it with spreadsheets and Visio as well, depending on what you're trying. In terms of your first part of your question, though, is it doesn't have to be daunting. You said you work for large enterprises. You could start with just one part of your business that maybe has some pain points, or some strategic objectives they're trying to hit, and
Yeah.
then do that one area, and then demonstrate some success, take the story to leadership, and then grow it from there. And you don't need all the use cases that I mentioned. You could start with one. It's really just start small and then grow as the organization needs.
Okay. I love that. So you mentioned value stream, and I was sort of waiting a good moment to ask you. I feel like that's the moment, Michael. So the only real process mapping theory and practice I know, which is called value stream mapping,
Yeah.
right? And it's really a big exercise, right? So our CTO in the enterprises I work for really love that. So we did that a couple of times, and it's just it's a big thing, right? So we would come for about like 3 days workshops, right? So it
Yeah.
would be 3 days in a row, and you definitely need to have a key decision makers within a certain process verticals, because they know the data which comes in, they know the data comes out, they know the lead times, how much they wait on dependencies and things like that. They know the process item times, so they can only give those answers. So it becomes like very expensive by its nature, because you have all of these decision makers in a room for like 3 days. And then if you're trying to map a huge value stream, let's say you're going from, well, here's something we want, like go to new market, and then here's our service in those market, like that's a huge
Yeah.
huge area to cover as a value stream. So it becomes basically a very, very big exercise. And then what it yields is a lot of information. It's like hundreds, well, not hundreds, but probably tens of initiatives to sort of make
Yeah.
all of that better, right? So you just mentioned very good point, right? If you are a team lead, or you're some type of manager, or maybe even not, if you see some issues, or you feel like you're having some issues, you can just map your process without understanding what the value stream map is, right? It's just a general sort of situation where you come in and you ask the team, how do we do this?
Yep.
Which leads to the question, Michael, like, what questions do you ask? Like, let's say I want to do this. Like, I go to my team right now. How do I start this?
So I always start with do your homework, because I don't want to ever come in, because if I'm doing this interview process, I don't want to come in with a blank sheet of paper, because I don't think it's valuable for the stakeholders' time. So I gather whatever information I can, whether it's org charts or other internal documents, and create a draft of it. And then when I have the meeting, I lay it out in front of them and say, is this what you do? Or tell me what gaps or what I've gotten wrong, et cetera. And they say, change this, add this, whatever it may be. But then that's a very, very quick process. And I just want to draw one distinction. What I'm talking about is organizationally based processes. So I'm just tackling one organization or one team or whatever that may be. How it ties to value streams are end to end, and they can cut across organizational units. So one group does one thing, they hand it off to another group. But what I typically see is people that do the value streams can't then drive it down to the lowest level of detail of what a specific person does, what specific technology does. So once you have this inventory, now you could lay out the stages of your end-to-end value stream, and now plot what specific organizational processes do what. And that's a good way to get that high level view of end-to-end, but then also drive it down to the lowest level detail if you have to do root cause analysis or solutioning.
Do I need to be part of that team to actually do this well? I'm just thinking from a perspective, how do I know that I finished going as deep as I should be to actually map out the process? You know what I mean? Like, if I'm talking with someone, and let's say I'm not that domain expert of whatever that team does, I don't even know when I should stop going deeper in the sense of understanding a full process, right?
Yeah.
So I should be sort of like part of the team to do this well?
No, you could do it. when I've done this at clients, I've done it in a federated manner. So businesses could do this themselves. So it doesn't have to be just the central team, but a central team's needed to define standards, because different organizations that create this, it all has to look and feel the same, so that you could read a process inventory for any group without kind of having a decoder ring. So things like verb noun. So every process should be named with the action, because that's what a process is. So, submit payment or open account, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And then I do want to draw one distinction too: the difference between just process names and process models. In my view, just the names alone is really valuable, and that could be a quick thing to do, because you're just asking people what they do. You're listing the processes, and then you could come back later and say, okay, which ones do you need to know more about, and then dive into the details.
Okay, I get that. What is when you do this exercise, Michael? What is one thing in your experience, because you did that many times? Like, does anything comes out in your mind when I ask, what do people get most surprised about when they actually do this exercise?
I don't know about surprise, but I think they're the most appreciative about just the transparency. Like,
Just
they get to
being able,
see
yeah.
everything that their organization does, and who does it, and the resources that are leveraged. So I've done this for organizations, and years later they've called me and said, "Man, we're still using this. It's like really important and valuable thing." And I think and we could talk about alignment, but I think that's one of the reasons why transformations fail is because of the chaos and alignment. And I think that there's a couple parts of that. There's vertical alignment, so from strategic leaders down to individual contributors, making sure that everyone is doing, acting in accordance with what the strategic objectives are. And then there's horizontal, so having kind of peer teams that know how to work with each other better. So that's business working with technology, et cetera. And it's my assertion, and I've seen this many times, that like leadership doesn't really know what people do on their team if they get 3 or so levels down from their hierarchy, and they don't get the true story because they get a story that's crafted for them. But having this map laid out, they could go down to the details and understand, oh, there's a problem in a certain area. Inquire the team which is the specific process, and if they want to roll up their sleeves and get in the details, now they have the map to be able to do it.
Yeah, I love that. I've been on the receiving end on both of these. One thing which for me personally, when I did my first value stream map, which surprised me most, and I feel like I've seen that a couple of times at least, when people realize the impact of lead time for some of the process items.
Yeah.
When you are within the process, you just like, oh, we need to wait for this. Okay, let's think something else we can do in the meantime. You don't tangibly really understand the impact it has on the whole value stream.
Yeah.
Because it's all downstream process, right?
That's right.
And then when you put it on paper, like 14 days, the stakeholders see that and they go like, well, that's not acceptable.
Yeah.
And suddenly now they see that, right? And suddenly now they can resolve that situation, and having that map is just so powerful. So
it goes back to Lean Six Sigma principles, like overproduction in one step of the process that causes build up in the next step it's wasteful. So looking at the entire thing and understanding where the bottlenecks are gets you that streamlined end-to-end process, which could have a big impact on how you produce stuff and how you serve your customers, and really having that outside in view and outside in and inside out view, so that you could really streamline everything.
So how do you go about identifying waste within business processes? Is that simply as do the exercise and see what the numbers are, or are there more like specific maybe questions or insights you can share particularly about the identifying waste within the processes?
Well, I think if you look at a process inventory, you could start to see I see a bunch of things that are happening here, but I don't see a lot of value from it, and I see a lot of people. So you could just look at it. There's other methods too. Like when I do a process inventory, since I'm capturing individual processes in each organization, I map it to a business capability model or a standard process model like APQC. But then because that gives me the thesaurus to my dictionary. So each individual process is the dictionary, but now I get to see like processes across different areas, and I get to see like technology and other resources. And in, I was working with one client that had for instance, a centralized procurement group, but they gave a lot of their line of businesses latitude to do their own procurement. So you could have procurements in a number of different areas, and that obviously is not only more money spent, but that there's more risks of straying outside of procurement policies, et cetera. So now you could look at the entire organization and say, why do we do this thing in all these different groups? Like, does that make sense, or should we consolidate? So there's a number of different techniques, but what this does is gives you a map of the organization to analyze it from multiple different angles.
Things you're saying, Michael, and I'm getting like images. It's almost like it's coming back screaming at me. The type of situation where I know within our businesses there's so many areas where we have inefficiencies simply because there's a big handover, but I think there's as well overlap of teams doing the same things.
Yep.
And when I think about why we're not doing this better, and we did value stream mapping, and we have people sitting looking at processes. We don't have dedicated process excellence type of people, but everybody care about being efficient. Yep. And one thing which comes out is that we don't really have enough time to concentrate to drive these process excellent type of situations. So my question would be, is the conclusion I'm getting right now in my head is that without having dedicated people, you're unlikely going to be successful with this?
I wouldn't necessarily say it has to be a full-time role, but it has to be somebody that carries this responsibility. So it could be depending on the size of your organization. You started the conversation with startups, and if you're a 10 or 15 person organization, you're not going to have a 5-person team dedicated to this. But you could identify somebody who does it kind of maybe on the side, and it doesn't have to be a big effort, but just having this map of what your organization does is really critical. And when it comes to startups too, there's a natural evolution, and startups typically are focused initially on growth and revenue and building things. But there comes a point in time where margin really starts to matter. And that's where you have to look internally and saying, are we being the most efficient with what we're trying to accomplish? And having all these resources identified where you could align costs and other metrics really gives you the ability to think about how you're designing the organization and how it operates, as opposed to, in many cases, things just evolve.
Yeah, which is reality for majority, to be honest.
Yeah.
This is such a rare situation when I meet founders of fairly successful startups where you can talk about processes and automation, and they go like, here you go, Mike, we have all of these maps and we already did the exercises. It's always very chaotic. Yeah. It's almost like it's wild west. There's a constant element of firefighting mixed with some type of strategic growth. It just feels like it's a nature of startup, right? That lack of maturity within those processes.
Yep.
So you talked about a little bit about alignment, Michael. So I wanna throw in that Harvard Business Review quote. Misalignment between teams is a leading cause of strategic failure, often stemming from unclear processes and handoffs between the teams. So my question would be, can you give us a picture of how work looks like? Maybe it's a utopian picture, but how does the work looks like, and how does the result looks like when you actually have aligned teams?
Yeah. So I think one of Harvard doesn't mention this, but I think a lot of the root cause is lack of language. And if you've ever seen the famous tree swing cartoon, which I use all the time in presentations, but it says, this is what the customer wanted, this is what the product manager designed,
I do remember that
whole thing.
Yeah.
And it's because we all have different perspectives. And probably the biggest one is business and technology. Like, they speak different languages. So the level of communication of how they work is going to be different. But if you give them a process inventory, which essentially becomes a language, and now the business could say, I want this process process updated with these requirements. Now the
Mhm.
technology person can say, I know what technology it uses, depending on level of depth. I know the APIs, what system logic is invoked, et cetera. Now you get clear communications between them. And I'm a big advocate for when you run a change project, you should scope your projects, i.e. project charter, by what processes are involved, do requirements by each, what is the requirements for each process, do your design, do your testing, because you should test each process, whether it's directly changing or being impacted, and do all your organizational change management. So create your procedures aligned to process, your training, your job aids. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing is just being transparent about what people do. So, we've all been in a situation where the team down the hall or another building, we kind of know what they do, but we don't know in detail. So we don't
Mhm.
exactly know how to interact with them and how to leverage them. But if you create this process inventory and make it transparent to everyone, you say, I know exactly what they do and I know how I need to leverage them better.
You just gave me an idea. I'm gonna go to some of the teams within the business, and I'm gonna be like, "Hey, I need to know how you guys work.
Yeah.
we're gonna we're gonna do a process inventory right now." Because you mentioned the leverage, and a couple of things popped in my head where my lack of understanding how they do things, I filled it with some probably biased opinions about what they
Yeah.
do, which was wrong, which led to not the best decisions. So this is a very, very strong um, statement we're making, that as a team lead or a manager, if you really want to, if you work in a big enterprises and you want to understand better how teams deliver value for the business, you could probably just walk in there and go like, "Hey guys, do you have process inventory?"
Yep.
And they might go like, "No," and you can go like, "Well, let me help you to create this. There's a bunch of value to you and as well me at the same time."
Exactly. It's all about transparency and understanding. Yeah.
Okay, I do love that. All right, so I was saying that the execution of speed or efficiency is literally gained from the fact that we talk the same language, and that language effectively becomes our process inventory. And because we know how you work, you know how I work, by default we can expect some speed gains.
Yep.
Okay, it's just
Oh, for
simple as
sure,
that.
for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, because there's when you're working with a new team, there's a lot of feeling out and negotiating, et cetera. But if you can understand exactly everything that they do, you're like, hey, I need. Can you do this thing that you do already? Or maybe they're not doing something, and say, hey, can you add a new process because here's a new need. So
Mm. So are we just advocating over here to basically for every team to have their own process inventory and have it almost like, hey, if you want to know how we produce value to the business, check this page out.
yeah,
And it just becomes almost like a cultural health exercise
yeah.
to advocate as a business owner, as a CEO for the whole business.
Yeah, I think there's another angle to this too,
Mm.
which I think is important, which is the employees. So I'm big on accountability, and when you do this process inventory, I not only detail out every process, but I identify a named owner within the organization who's not only responsible for improving the process, but executing on a day to day basis.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of different innovation models that are coming out, like open innovation, where you use external sources like customers and the general public, et cetera. But then there's democratic innovation, where you recognize that every employee has some level of expertise in what they do. And if you could tap into that, and now you could drive innovation in every process or product or everything that you do within your environment. And that's and you need two things to make that happen. You need accountability, which I think process inventory does at a detailed level, because if everyone's responsible for something, no one's responsible. But also, if leadership could build a culture of um, 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 autonomy, where they are encouraged to test new ideas, where there's an understanding that not everything will work, but we will reward the initiative, then now everyone becomes an engine of innovation. And one of the things you need to do is you need to arm them with data and information, and that's what process inventory provides, because now they get an entire understanding of the landscape, upstream, downstream processes, and how they could streamline things just to make the overall environment better.
I love that. I love that so much, Michael. Just so much ideas in my head
Yeah.
right now. I almost forgetting all my questions. Well, you mentioned this, which I really love, and I don't know if that's your quote or someone else said it. You said if someone's responsible for it, no one is responsible for it.
Exactly.
And I feel like this is amen. That should be like something put on the wall, because yeah, if someone doesn't own an item, no one's like have time or willingness to just go like, yeah, I'll take that. It just becomes something which sits around everyone, but no one's really owns it. And
Exactly.
if no one owns that process item, that means it's just going to be bottleneck by default, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And it won't receive the attention. It may happen fast sometimes. It may be slow. And then leadership can't really put the metrics on it of what they care about in terms of success and health, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it becomes really important.
Okay. So one thing which I've seen happen multiple times is that, okay, we have a workflow, we're doing something within the business. And when I say we have a workflow, we don't have a process inventory. We just have something of how we produce value. Business wants more efficiency, and they go in, we're gonna buy this tool.
Hmm.
And whatever is the tool, let's call it tool X. For sales, maybe it's like Salesforce. For some product people, maybe it's like Miro or some prototyping, Jira, Atlassian.
Yep.
For project management, many tools. Like these are almost gospels. Like we know they exist, we all use it every day. But then you have a little bit smaller tools, and someone goes on some type of like conference or event,
Yep.
gets sold on it. They like, boom, it's gonna solve our problems, right? That happens a lot. And I want to read this quote from TechCrunch. Startup waste an average of 30% of SaaS spend, often due to unclear workflows or poor implementations, which leads to this question, Michael, is like when you have a messy processes, you don't really understand fully because you have not mapped that. What really happens when you're layering in tech on top of that?
Well, when you're purchasing new tools, there's many questions you should ask, but one is, what is it going to do for me? And if you can map it to what specific processes it's going to enable, then that gives clarity, not only for the enterprise architecture team to design the architecture, but just to have clarity on what it does. But another question should be, do we already have this functionality in some other tool? Like,
Mm,
especially for larger organizations, you'll see one organization buy a tool where another organization already has it, when the natural question is, why can't you just use that? And if you don't have an understanding of what all the businesses have, or what they do and what they leverage, then you're going to miss a lot of those things. And ultimately, the implications are that is a complex environment, which leads to lack of agility. So now it takes so much longer to implement a relatively easy change, because you have so much complexity within the environment. And then it also means higher costs
yeah.
that you have to carry on the
Mm.
bottom line.
Why is it still happening, Michael? It's like I could give you a couple of examples, which I know from very, very big businesses in e-commerce space, and then in my own space, where the tools are being given, this decisions has been made, and the tool is being given to implement.
Hmm.
And then you are on the receiving end. You are effectively, a manager, a team lead. You receive the tool, which supposed to make your teams and everyone downstream life better. And then you go like, no one really asked me about the value this tool will give to me. I'm just
Yeah.
being handed that. Like, why this is still happening like today?
Well, it's a great point, because organizations have to do the work to really detail out what they do. And if you, now in the case you mentioned where someone's proposing a new tool, I would map it to the processes, not then before I even purchased it, map it to the process, build a business case, et cetera. But I would talk to
Mm,
each of those individual process owners and get their feedback. Like, how would you leverage this? Like, would this
yeah.
make your life better? And really, before you even sign the contract to purchase it, now you have a good understanding of if people are supportive, if the benefits it's gonna bring, et cetera.
That's no brainer. Like to me,
Yeah.
Michael, like I would go like that's exactly what I would do. But at the same time, I can see things being differently and all done being differently, and always ask this question: Is this? are the sales teams so good of these tools that they just managed to convince the leadership just to buy it and just
Yeah.
don't worry about it. It's just going to be excellent. We'll come in, we'll teach everyone or whatever. I
Yeah.
don't know what they say. Like why do stakeholders buy into really expensive tools without really mapping the processes
Yeah.
and having a chat with the teams and
I'll
asking these
give you
questions, right?
another scenario which
Yeah.
I think is related to it. Is I worked at one bank and they outsourced their mortgage servicing to a third party provider, but it ended up in years of just mess and chaos. And I think it really could have been solved up front if you would have mapped out, for instance, every single mortgage servicing process and start to identify what's the metrics for each, SLAs, et cetera, and then put that up front in the contract. And there's regulatory obligations that they have to comply with, et cetera. But if they put that up front in the contract and now get the vendor to sign off and these are the expectations and these are the financial penalties if you fail to perform, that whole mess, I think, would have gone away right up front. So you went and they dealt with that for 3 to 5 years or something like that. So, and that impacted ultimately their customers, which they had a lot of complaints. So,
Yeah.
there's a lot of uses for this.
Yeah, and no one during that 3 to 5 years raised the question: should we just map the processes out?
Yeah.
Because
So,
people,
and that's, people, and, that's something I get all the time. Well, it seems like a lot of work. Sure.
yeah,
But I always look at it, you're going to pay for your chaos. So you either pay for it up front with an investment just to really just get organized, get your house in order, or you're going to pay for it down the road with 70% of transformations fail and the budget implications and the timeline implications and the lack of functionality and the defects and the impact to customers. Like you really have to weigh, every decision is not without a cost, and without doing something like this, you're most likely going to pay the cost.
yeah. I mean, ultimately, a good running business will know really, really well what the process of them producing value to the market is, and they will know that so well that they will be able to make it a lot more efficient, either by automation or some other means to get the margins better. And that you see that all the time, and as well right now in this almost like a gig economy, I want to call it, where you have domain experts, offering knowledge and skills in a sense of like courses. If you go to talk with them, they all will have their processes of how they will help you. And that's going to be their secret formula. They will give you that process so you can take it and sort of understand and implement, right?
Yep.
So ultimately, everything ends up being a well-oiled process.
Yep.
Yeah, I love that.
That's how it should be for every organization, but unfortunately, that's not the case.
That's not the case. Which raises a very important question: is like, does the leadership, business ownership, boards, do they not aware of it, or is it just a pure lack of knowledge, or they know but they go like, what, I think I can do better without the processes?
Well, one of the things I think, and I think it's a fault of the process management community, to be honest with you, is that I don't think that there's been a comprehensive way of how to do this. And I think a lot of, when you think about an organization, they talk about people, process, technology. So if you ask any leader, is process important? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, of course.
Yeah.
But I think in their experiences, they've been involved in some process team that, did some stuff, but really didn't have an impact on the organization. So it's, their perspective is, yeah, but it never really works out. And,
Right.
and I've seen a lot of organizations, and, I've worked in financial services and banking specifically, and mapping of risks and regulatory is huge. And they've started these massive programs, but without a vision for how to do this, like down to the detail, like how do you run these teams? How do you do governance? How do you create the models? How do you connect them together? There's a lot of things to answer in there. And without that vision, then, many of these things fail to deliver the value that they're expecting. And that's why I wrote the book, is because I think there's a gap in the conventional thinking for process management. And and what I lay out in my book is all the details for how to do this successfully at scale.
I love it. It's a great book. Again,
thank you.
People should buy it and go into it. I mean, we will not do the justice in the 60 minutes of this episode when it comes to the book. If you're really excited about the topic and the value can bring, yeah, second shout, go get the book. So let's imagine now, Michael, that we are in a space with our business where we map the processes. Maybe we are small to medium enterprises, so we don't have that many of them. But let's say it's in the tens, right? So 10, 15, maybe 20. We have the maps. We know how things work. We know how the team A works. We know how the team B works. So we have that map, and the question someone asks right now is like, okay, well, how do I get efficiency within this? And the very first thing which comes to my mind is automation, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you know which areas are ripe for automation?
Yep. So I have a friend who works at a automation consulting company, and his point, I think it's right, is that process discovery is probably the biggest value that can be added, because a lot of organizations, they'll maybe do surveys of what processes to automate, but how do you know that that is indeed the right process?
Mm-hmm.
But if you could lay it out in a structured map, now you could say, okay, of all these processes, and you could put it to leadership, which ones are the biggest pain points? Which ones keep you up at night? Objectively, which ones have the worst metrics relative to what we're trying to the value that we're trying to deliver? Now when you have that, now you could say, now you could rank them based on priority, and you're putting your automation dollars to what's really important. But then also now you give the automation teams a wealth of information, because a lot of automation efforts have to start with current state analysis. Like, what is this thing? What does it connect to, et cetera? Now I'm leapfrogging that whole thing, because I'm arming them with this information, so they could take weeks or months or whatever it takes to do that current state analysis and jump right to solutioning, because they have all the data at their fingertips.
So we're thinking effectively from the perspective of return on investment, right? So because we have the processes done, so our process inventory is there, we're choosing effectively the biggest pain points, the biggest value to our customers or to the market production, because we're going to be spending money with automation. So we just want to automate the processes, which at the end of the day result back in say more revenue. And that's how we're making the choice. So it's just a pure return of investment, time investment versus how much value we're going to get back.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Is there any
and quality too? I would think there's some level of quality and risk management involved with automation as well.
100%. So what I was going, trying to collect my thoughts is that managing automation is a job by itself, right? So the more complex automation workflows you create, the more likely you'll need to sort of look at this all the time, right? And that leads to sort of like a follow-up question. Is there a thinking pattern where you go like, you know what, I wouldn't automate this because of just pure complexity or something like that?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of complex processes out there that absolutely can be automated, and that could mean less people. And we talked about quality. There's a lot of different reasons, but having that full map gives you all the details you need to choose what are the right processes.
Okay. Right. So let's put AI into all of this.
I was waiting for that.
So let's just put some AI into it. So we have the maps. We have chosen our biggest pain points or biggest value production. So we have the workflows, which we want to automate now. And some of these workflows require some decision making, right? So this is what effectively AI agents or agentic automation is enabling at this point in time, is that within those workflows, instead of having these binary sort of situations, we can actually put in some LLMs, train them on particular areas of our business, and they will be able to make these decisions and automate these, fairly complex workflows, right? It's great. Sounds good on paper. In reality, it's actually a little bit, a little bit more complicated. And the question and the quote I want to read is it's from MIT Sloan, which basically goes like this: AI delivers the biggest benefits when built on structured and consistent operational data, right? Otherwise, it amplifies inconsistencies. And the question is, how do you prepare or how do you gather your data so you can actually leverage that well?
Yeah, so it goes to, so I think process inventory is the anchor for it. So And I mentioned, so once you have your process inventory, now you could collect all data about how you run your business and align it to a specific process. So a process uses, a certain Salesforce or whatnot, and it has these people and it leverages these vendors and it has these risks and controls, et cetera. But
Mm-hmm.
essentially, what you're building is an entire kind of repository for how things work, and really it gets into digital twin. So I don't know if you've heard of the concept of digital twin, but it's creating a model of your organization. Well, it got big in manufacturing and physical components. So there's smart
Mm-hmm.
factories out there. And what they do is they create a model of their factory or engine part or whatever it may be. And they're using that to train AI on how things work. But in the instance of a factory, now you have station one does this, station two does this, station three does this. Now AI knows exactly what's happening there, and they could put IoT sensors or any other kind of data collection feeds in it,
Yep.
and send that in. And now AI can understand, can do analysis on that, do predictive analytics, do simulations, do data driven decision making, really help you with everything. So but that hasn't translated into information based businesses. So I come from financial services. And there's nothing physical because people could be in any building, any part of the world, et cetera. So I really think the anchor point for creating a digital twin is document your process, align the data, use that to train AI, and now start feeding data signals into that digital twin platform. So your defects, your customer complaints, your issues, your process mining data, your task mining data, whatever it is. Now it all can be associated with what process it's describing, and now you could have insights into everything. But now that's where it gets into agentic AI as well as now, and I could think of a scenario, for instance, where I speak into my phone. I say, I want to add this functionality to my website. And in a multi agentic AI environment, you have one AI that's just doing impact analysis. So it looks into this repository of information. It says, okay, what processes exist? What are they asking for? What's needed? What technology does this go on? What's the impact across the board? It hands it to another agentic AI that goes into the source code repository, identifies what code needs to be created, develops the code, throws it to another one that puts it in your CI/CD pipeline where you do the code deployment, automatic testing, creates all your documentation, and then the user's coming in in a matter of hours or whatever it takes, and they're testing the new functionality. So that could take your development time from or a deployment time for change from months to a matter of days or weeks. But I could think of a ton of scenarios: automated risk assessments, doing project planning for a large transformation where you get down, if you feed it an estimating model, it could get down to how much time per each team and what's the duration, et cetera. So I think there's some really exciting stuff. But what you're doing here is now you're training AI on what your business does, and you're giving it that common language so it could resolve all any conflicts of information.
How realistic is that you can actually do this as a small to medium business? Just cost-wise, creation-wise, management of these agentic workflows. Yeah.
I would think about it first of, you don't necessarily have to do it for your entire enterprise, but there could be key areas where this is important. And you'll have to weigh the cost of doing it versus the value, but I could think of a lot of business areas that could certainly leverage this.
So is there a readiness checklist you would think about, Michael, sort of going like, look, this is, first of all, we do the process, right? Do the process, inventory, have the processes mapped out. Then second is identify your areas which are great for automation, which we talked about. So we have that as well. And now it's a question of like, okay, well, which of these are actually ready for agentic AI, which leads to this question, are we actually capturing enough data to be
Yep.
even able to extract the value of such of the automation?
Yeah. I would, if I was an organization, I would do a test scenario first just to
Yeah.
try it out. And I would focus on an area that is probably high cost in terms of number of resources, but it's not necessarily a lot of value. where you could shift those, because well, AI is going to have an impact on people. I mean, I think we all know that, but now you could
Mhm.
shift those people from manual and mundane and repetitive tasks and move them to customer facing and value creation tasks, and just generally get more value from your company as a whole.
How you say move? You mean replace them effectively with AI, agentic AI? So to get that function done and move them into something else. That's what you.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
replace them. I would shift them to somewhere else in the
Yeah.
in the organization that is that is more thought leadership and more higher cognitive and higher value.
Okay, so yeah, that's. I mean, it's taking place even right now. It's just
Yeah,
the acceleration of all the technologies. It's scary by itself. If you are in the market and you're seeing how agentic AI moving, it's just so easy to see that happening.
yeah,
Fairly quickly, to be honest. So that being said, though, there is an element of shiny AI object type of situation where everything is just AI now. People want to buy tools. Someone mentions AI and problem solving, they like, yeah, here's take my money. So if I'm a business owner, how do I just not buy into that hype? Like, can I have some, I don't know, red flags or green flag type of situation where I can take my decision through a certain prism and go like, you know what, without something, I'm not going to be able to leverage that tool.
yeah. I think there's you have to think about what you're trying to get from it, and really think about the value and build the business case. I think you said it before. Uh, the key to AI is data. So if you give it garbage data that's confusing, overlapping, conflicting, then you're not really gonna get value out of it that you anticipate. So I think and then I think there's the practical data security of a lot of organizations are worried about their data, their
Mm,
proprietary data getting out to the environment. So there's a lot of things you have to look at. But I do think Pandora's box has been opened and
yeah.
it is coming. And I've been skeptical about a lot of other technology advancements. In some ways, I think everything has value, but I think the hype didn't match up to the value that it actually provided. I think AI can, I'm buying into the hype of what it can be. I mean, obviously there's going to be overstatements or whatnot, but yeah, it's going to be a game changer in terms of how organizations operate.
Yeah, I buy into that as well. I mean, I do agentic AIs by default, so I can see how everything is advancing, and we've been in a state of just sort of generative AI just giving us outputs where they all looked cool, videos and audios and the
Yeah,
text. We were really lacking decision making and actioning, and with agentic AI, where you can build up workflows which makes call for you and actions elements and you combine that into your complex workflows. That's
yeah,
basically replacing a role. That's a proper digital employee.
yeah.
Like if you set it up, and it has been done in multiple big businesses. There's some very great use cases coming from Fortune 500 companies. So yeah, it's
There,
it's it's happening.
there's also value in modeling, leveraging AI. So I talked about the interview process, et cetera, and all the data alignment.
Mm,
And I'm maybe a little bit biased because I spent a lot of my time in financial services and banking. But if you scan the headlines, you see a new bank getting hit with a regulatory fine or some consent order, et cetera. So they always struggle with, especially in industries where there's just a sea of regulation.
yeah,
What do they have to do? And those regulations are essentially requirements on processes of what I have to do per what some certain law or regulator says. And if I have, and I've been doing this, and I think it's mind boggling how efficient it is. But if I give it AI a list of processes and tell me what are my regulatory obligations and give me the risk statement and control statement, it gives me all of it.
hmm,
And now I've taken something that takes teams of people with first line of defense, second line of defense, third line of defense, et cetera. And now I could understand all the regulations for each process. Now I could give that to the process owner and the development team so that they could identify what controls are needed and implement those controls. But it could really change the game in terms of how I communicate with regulators, because a lot of these regulatory actions are not because of the big things that you see in the headlines. A lot of it is, and I was talking to a regulatory expert yesterday, It's when regulators come in and do an exam and they find out that you don't really have control of the situation, that you're making it up as you go along. So having clarity is important. And I think process inventory combined with AI helping you do all this mapping is one good case study. Another thing is I was once I have an inventory of processes with the descriptions and whatnot, I could create requirements documents using AI. I could create test scripts using AI. I could create procedure documents. Really, alignment doesn't just go through the people, but it's all the knowledge. So if you align all knowledge to a process, and you're going to go back and forth with people, you got to adjust these, et cetera. But now you could have a standard body of knowledge all aligned to the process, which is incredibly valuable. And AI could be a big help for you creating that.
So you mentioned regulators, Michael, and I work for a regulated market as well, and we deal with regulators within every new market we enter. And one thing which is holding us back to fully utilizing AI is the hallucination element of it, right? Yep. So there's a real fear that we would take what they say, give it as an answer, and then if the AI hallucinated, the liability will sit with us, right? So you mentioned the use cases around financial markets, which again is very similar use case. What if you're getting a wrong answer?
Yeah, well, and I like to point out, there's been some cases in the U.S., legal cases, where the lawyers used AI to find other cases to support their arguments, and the judge looks at it and says, all these citations don't exist.
Yeah.
Which is embarrassing for the lawyer, and I'm sure they got into a lot of trouble. I was at a conference and there was someone that was talking about AI, and he said, think of it as your assistant. And if you hired an assistant today and he gave you a bunch of stuff, you wouldn't blindly pass it on to wherever you're passing it on to. You would do some checks. And I think you still have to check, you still have to validate, and maybe over time you could build trust. But I think you as the person and the owner of that task still have to take responsibility for what's in there. So this regulatory mapping that I mentioned, I would use it as a starting point. Organizations in highly regulated environments have compliance teams and have legal teams that can double check on it.
Yeah.
But it gives you a big leg up by giving that starting point. Maybe it's 80% complete, which is a huge value add from starting from a blank sheet of paper.
Yeah. Trust but verify.
Exactly.
All right, let's go into rapid questions, Michael. So question, quick answer. We got about 10, which I want to squeeze in.
Perfect.
What's a quick way to identify bottlenecks in the workflow?
Just align the resources and understand, align resources and the metrics. So what metrics are slowing things down, and where is it?
What metric do I care about when it comes to bottleneck? Is it just like the whole area being slow in the sense of like days, or am I looking, there's 5 people doing this, it should be just 1, or lead times, any specific sort of KPIs around bottlenecks?
Every process has its own context, so it really depends. But it could be throughput time, it could be SLAs and responding, it could be cost and number of resources. If I have a lot of resources but things are really slow, then that's something to dig into.
All right. How do you ensure everyone follows a new process? So effectively, you looked at something, you mapped it out, it's poor, we improved it. How do we police this now into reality?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's a responsibility. So when I define ownership of a process, I also, because process inventory is structured as a taxonomy, and every node in that taxonomy has ownership, which means you don't just own your process. Your boss has some level of ownership, and their boss has some level of ownership. So I think it still comes down to local. Like if you could define the metrics for every process, now I could hold you accountable for hitting those metrics, but then your leadership is responsible and their leadership is responsible. So I think it still comes down to good management, but they're aided by more transparency and more clarity.
Okay. I get you. Yeah, I do agree. You have to lead by example. I mean, it needs to come from the top. Can a process be too complex, and what signs are there for process being too complex?
Oh, sure. If you have a lot, There's a, um, and I'm getting the name wrong, but Parkinson's theory.
Mm,
I forget exactly what it is, but it was a British naval historian who was studying the British Navy and the growth of the bureaucracy over time. And what he found is there's a period of decades where there was less wars and less need for ships, but the growth in the bureaucracy kept going up. So,
mhm.
and what that really states is that people like to have people report to them, and they like to have people to. So if you give people, and they advocate for budget, and they could get that budget without any kind of objective analysis from their leadership. So you could have areas where there's a lot of fat and overhead in terms of number of people doing things that aren't value added. And I think that's the biggest reason why there's complexity. So I've been in some areas where, you do the process inventory and you're like, you really don't do anything. And it's
Mm,
really becomes a situation where the checker's checking the checker who checks the checker.
mm. It's funny because it's true, but yeah, I've seen that so many times. Right. How do you maintain process compliance across distributed teams? And maybe that's the wrong word I'm using, compliance, but effectively, when you have a handoff between the
Yeah.
teams, this is where I see a lot of processes sort of, breaking down. It's like, how do you make sure that that handoff is done in such a way that, we have a efficient and healthy process?
Well, once you identify all the processes, you could identify what's the upstream and downstream process, and now you could focus on what is the procedure for handoff. What's the SLA time? What's the format of whatever you're handing off? What's the quality expectations? You could really dig down into what you're expecting in that handoff, and now that level of insight gives you more visibility to be able to manage it.
Okay. So it's almost like APIs in a way, but it's teams. But then we have an agreement, a contract of like what data I'm giving out, and you tell me in what format you want to receive it, and that just
Yeah.
becomes our handover type of,
If I'm
of
giving you
that.
a status report, here's my expectations for what's in it and the
Yeah.
format and who reviewed it, and you could layer on all that.
Okay. So we think that the feedback around these things when it comes to people doing the process items are critical then.
Hmm.
Like we have to constantly be asking the question, is this working? Can this be better? How
Yeah.
do you need your data? And similar questions. Oh, I don't see that happening that often. And I'm thinking now, am I doing this? Probably not.
Yeah.
I'm guilty on.
And the beauty of
Mm,
it is a lot of organizations will have a dedicated process reengineering team or Lean Six Sigma or whatever they call it. But now if you make all the data transparent, you make the accountability very strong, then now
mm,
you're distributing it across everybody. Everybody should be looking at, why is this working this way? How can I make it better?
yeah. Such a simple question to ask, to be honest. And there's so much value in it. And I'm like, okay, why am I doing this? And it just comes back to just being busy. It's just like, just too busy to care about this, which is not good, right? You need to take
Yeah.
a step back, zoom out, and really look at your process.
Yep.
There's something I'm going to take from this episode. So thanks, Michael. Right. So scaling challenges, right? So I've seen this picture where startups raise money and the things just change like next day, right? Like one
Yep.
day they were like 40 people, they just raised money. 3 months later, they're like 200, right? So that speed of growth really it's like it's fun and it's great and it's a success story, but at the same time it's very painful to get that business back in shape and operating through process
Yeah.
and stuff. How do you manage that change? Like do you have any advice
Well,
for
I, I,
founders?
I have a story. So I
Yeah.
worked with in my consulting capacity where there was a spinoff from a global insurance company to another smaller U.S. based company because they just didn't think it was core to their business,
Mm,
and they went through that exact. So think of it as it's a startup with billions of dollars in assets in insurance assets. But one of the first things they did is we need staff, so they just began just hiring, tens, 50, 100 people, etc., but really didn't put a lot of thought in what they were going to do. So there's a lot of people running around with like chickens with their heads cut off. They're like, what are we
mm,
doing?
yeah.
And that wasted months and weeks or months and lots of dollars, etc. where it would be better just to lay out like, what is it that we have to do? And that could be done in a matter of weeks by just a couple people. And then now assign specifically, we're hiring this person to do this thing. And you could avoid all that chaos up front.
So simple.
Yeah.
So simple. When you think about it, I mean, in practice, I'm sure it's more difficult, but on paper and conversation, it just seems so simple, but at the same time, people trip over this very often. Yeah. What you just mentioned, Michael, do you align this do you start with the business goal? So effectively, you set business goal, like a big vision, what we're going to be doing, what we're going after in the next 3 years or 5 years. And from that point on, you just lay out the process and you go here's how we're going to sort of go after it. Is that a good assumption, or is it more of let's do a process inventory, see how we're actually doing this, and then put some OKRs on top of that?
If I'm starting with a startup type situation, you know what your products are. So I need to develop widgets. So I need to have a team that creates the widgets. I know I need to sell the widgets. So I need people that can prospect clients and build a sales pitch and close deals, et cetera. I know I need internal stuff, like I need a finance team to keep track of where the money is, et cetera, right? So I would start with those big buckets. Like, what are all the things we need? And then I would just keep going down those buckets and saying, what's the next level and what's the next level until I get all the processes. And if you're in a startup, you're not going to necessarily nail that, but that gives you an idea of everything you need that you could iterate on as you hire people, as you do things, as you see what works, what doesn't. And then it gives you the basis for being more intentional in how you grow.
I love that. Very, very healthy recipe of how to look at that point in time. All right. Well, that was excellent, Michael. So many things you shared where my brain just escaped my body for a couple of seconds, where I was just imagining situations in life and just thinking about okay, there's multiple things I could do better. So I grew from this episode, so thank for that, and I'm sure our listeners did. If they want to learn more about your book, you and other things you're doing, where can they find you? How they can get in touch with you?
Yeah. So first, the book is Digital Transformation Success. You can find it on Amazon. So if you liked what we talked about, there's a lot of details in there. LinkedIn, I post a lot about some of these concepts. So reach out to me and have a discussion. And I'll say this too, a lot of what I talk about is very theoretical maybe, or may come across it because people can't connect with it. I have created reference models that detail out this. So if anyone's really interested to see what it looks like, please reach out to me. And then I do my own consulting. So processinventory.com if you want to learn about my services or reach out to have a discussion.
Excellent. Okay. So we have a book, we have your LinkedIn, and we have your business URL. So all of that will be in the show. You guys tuning in live, of course, you'll need to wait, but once that goes up, it will be in the show notes. Otherwise, put Michael Schank in LinkedIn and you will find his name. And if you're listening live, you probably already have a link. Just click on it, go have a chat. And for everyone having a value in the episode, make sure to subscribe. And if you have a friend which you believe right now is drowning in chaos, do share this episode with him or her. They will find value in this. And as always, guys, until the next time, stay safe and see you online.